last in Chapter 19, or I guess next to last, we'll talk about toxic and hazardous substances. Just briefly, again, it's not something that we talk a lot about. And then we'll get into the Superfund, okay, which is a big deal. So this came about in '76. It was later, right? And it started to regulate the chemicals, things that are used in industry, anything from makeup to golly only knows what, right? And the risks of injuries in using them for consumers, the risk of injuries in the production of, et cetera, and of course in the disposal of, and it talks about transportation and those types of things, and those have become extremely important. We live by a railroad, and we might be worried about the stuff that comes through in those tankers that have the skull and crossbones or whatever on them, right? And so it's a decent number of regulations in place for that. Won't talk about that too much more, but Superfund came about then in 1980, and the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, or CERCLA. Might want to remember that. I'm sure it's on the test, that which law ended up creating the Superfund. So it's CERCLA. And this is what set up Superfund sites, that we do hear about. We hear about them some today, but they're starting to minimize a little bit. But hazardous release requires some government notification, and government gets in to order responsible parties to clean up. And responsible parties could be current, former operators, owners, waste transporters, etc. This became a problem in banking. This became a big deal for us in worrying about if you lent somebody money, what happens then if they default on the loan and you foreclose, and then you find out that even maybe before that person owned the property there was environmental damage. The bank then might become responsible for it. And it became pretty scary. It was one of those things that for a few years was just scarier than hell, and you did everything you could to protect yourself, and you probably passed on a lot of loans that you otherwise would have made, unfortunately. And then it kind of wound down a little bit. We figured out how to ask the right questions. We figured out how to check the land, how to do the due diligence, right? Whether you were a buyer or a lender, in order to protect yourself. And after that, then things kind of evened out. That's the way it is with a lot of these laws and regulations when they take effect. They seem pretty daunting, and once they kind of even out a little bit, they become not as difficult to comply with as what was first thought. Okay? For example, I don't know of hardly any banks that have been sued now for environmental cleanup, at least to a significant extent. But we were scared to death for a few years. So, cost recoveries. When the Superfund first came about in the 80s, 90s, and whatnot, one of the complaints about it, and maybe rightfully so, it was originally set up, where the government was supposed to step in and try to work with companies to clean things up. And what happened, of course, is the government would come in and say, hey, this is awful, we need it cleaned up. And the business would argue and say, no, it's not so bad, we don't need to do anything about it. And they would get into legal pissing match, basically, about the whole thing. And a whole lot of lawyers made a whole lot of money for a long time, just arguing back and forth about who was going to pay up, and it really got away from the original intent of the Superfund. It became the Environmental Lawyers the Retirement Act instead of the Cleanup Act. And again, things have improved, I think, since then. Don't get me wrong; there's still plenty of lawsuits that go around. There's probably still lots of lawyers that make their living on these types of things, assessing blame and whatnot. But part of the deal is, we've got a lot more preemptive regulations and whatnot now, and so we don't have the prevalence of the Superfund sites. There probably still is many, but a lot of them have been remediated. They're in the process of being cleaned and fixed up, and the government has worked with some businesses, and so there's been a lot of improvement in that area, and thus the nastiness of it isn't quite as obvious as it once was. So business's proposal in some cases was to maybe prorate the liability. So if you did own it for a brief period of time, your contribution to the cleanup, and in fact, if you didn't contribute any to the pollution, might be a bunch smaller. Take a look at that. Instead, they would try to impose oftentimes full liability, say on a bank or lender that foreclosed, a property owner, even though they had no involvement in the actual creation of the pollution. The idea was it was their obligation to do the due diligence when they bought the property or lent money on it. Exempt small contributors of waste from Superfund liability and whatnot. And then site cleanup meet health and safety standards, as opposed to restoring it to some standard that's higher than that. Its natural beauty or whatever the standard may be. So we got and this is how pollution control sort of kind of got started, was citizen enforcement suits from others, from one person against another, and we call that a nuisance or trespass. Right, and again, it gets back to if you're polluting the creek that's above my land, okay, and that's coming through, and my cows need to drink that water, or my livestock, whatever type it might be, that can be considered maybe a trespass, but certainly a nuisance. Okay, and I'd have a right to sue you then to stop that, right? Because you're causing me some harm. You've got a duty of care. All the things that we know about when it comes to tort types of actions, and so those could happen. Strict liability has to do with certain companies and whatnot that might engage in practices that are just known to be polluting, and they'll be held strictly accountable, for those practices. Some trends, we're concerned about loss of natural ecosystems, water, big deal, and not so much the waterways, but the puddles and those types of things that are nesting places for certain waterfowl, etc. Ozone layer. Well, the ozone layer's gone down a little bit in importance. Again, because of laws that were passed 10, 15, 20 years ago that have gone in to protect that. You don't read too much about it. The greenhouse effect is still spoken of a lot. Population growth, there was a time 20, 30 years ago when they were saying that, geez, if the population kept growing the way it was, we were going to run out of food and everybody was going to starve, and they meant like by now. And instead we've got, people are obese and we got more food than we can eat, and on and on. And so a lot of the fears about population growth have been a little bit unfounded, although we continue to drain the resources of the world, as we produce more and more people. Corporate governance, or corporations' ability to or willingness to get involved in the social responsibility and those types of things. You're seeing more shareholders stand up and ask their companies that they own stock in to be more responsible. So it's coming right from the shareholders. So, and private property rights, like we talked about with the lawsuits and those types of things. Look at that, 30 to 50,000 animal and plant species extinctions per year. Huh? It's an increase in man-made causes. Rainforest clearing, we've seen that. Again, it used to be heavy in the news, not quite as much the last few years. I don't know if it's slowed down. And extinction means loss of information, possibly loss of things, plants, animals that are used for medical research, those types of things. So, the ozone, 1990. Okay, they quit producing the chlorofluorocarbons. They used to use those as propellants and like hairspray and those types of things. And they banned those. They also used to be in the old air conditioning systems. Okay, and they were deemed to cause problems to the ozone layer. And again, they banned those. You don't hear too much about the ozone now. I mean, at one time it probably never rose to the level of CO2 and global warming, but it was almost as bad for several years there, where the hole in the ozone was expanding and everybody was going to die of overexposure to the sun, and we'd all die of skin cancer and whatnot. So greenhouse effect, right? Global carbon dioxide levels are up 6% since 1960, according to the National Academy of Sciences. allegedly leads to warmer global temperatures. Could have some changing climate patterns, obviously rising sea levels. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997 countries agreed to lower emission levels, or at least goals and targets of lower emission levels. The French Accord, then, is that what it's called? The Paris Accord, I think, happened here 4, 5, 6 years ago. President Obama wanted to sign on with that. I don't believe our Congress acted, but Obama said that we would try to live by that. And of course, Trump has said that he has no real intention of involving the U.S. in that accord. So we'll see. At the current fertility rate, the world's population will grow to about 8 billion. That's not that long from now, 8 years, right? A study like that, they put a study by Johns Hopkins University. That's simple math, actually. Anybody that's been in my finance class could calculate that in a heartbeat, just about. Cultural and religious issues directly affect policy. Certainly, restrictions on number of children and whatnot. What's interesting is that there's a lot of areas in the world right now that are experiencing just the opposite. Japan, for example. Europe, actually, they're seeing some negative population growth, and certainly native population. In other words, Europe is expanding almost strictly due to immigration. If it's expanding at all, I think it might actually be shrinking even with immigration. Japan's definitely shrinking. The United States is growing modestly, and again, it's strictly due to immigration that's causing our growth. So corporate governance, right? Sustainability, and again, something that shareholders are asking about. How sustainable is this activity? What's the effects on the society, economic, environmental? G3 standard of global reporting. It's mandatory in a few countries, but the U.S. has not adopted that. Some companies voluntarily report. Good old Dan Quayle. He did run for president in 1996 and was beaten. Yeah. In 96, he would have been beaten by Clinton in his second term. There you have it, the end of chapter 19.